It was supposed to be just another day in court, or so they thought, when one arrogant cop decides to harass a black man standing outside the courthouse. He thinks it's a routine stop, a moment to flex his badge. But what he doesn't know, that man isn't just any man, he's a federal prosecutor, with the power to turn this officer's whole world upside down. What unfolds next is a collision of pride, prejudice, and the fight for justice in a system that's long overdue for a reckoning. And believe me, you won't believe how this story ends until we get there. So, tell us, what time is it where you're watching? And where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below. We love seeing how far this community reaches. It starts with a city that wears its history, like an old, weathered coat, Charleston, South Carolina. The cobblestone streets, lined with ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, don't just whisper stories, they carry them. Stories of struggle, of resilience, of moments that tested the soul of a nation. And on this quiet morning, with the golden light of the early sun casting long, soft shadows down East Bay Street, it feels like any other peaceful day. Tourists sip their coffee on the patios, snapping photos of the pastel-painted row houses. Locals pause a little longer at the corner shops, exchanging warm greetings as the southern breeze rolls in from the harbor. But beneath the calm, something stirs, something unseen but felt. Malcolm Pierce steps out of his black Lincoln, the door clicking softly behind him. He stands tall, straightening the cuffs of his navy blue suit. He's in his early 50s, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and a posture that speaks of confidence earned over decades. His dark brown skin seems to catch the light just right, his polished shoes resting on the uneven stones beneath his feet. He pauses for a moment, glancing at his reflection in the car's glossy surface, a man of purpose, of law, of dignity. But there's a weight in his chest today, something he can't quite name. The courthouse looms just ahead, its grand neoclassical columns rising like sentinels from another time, a relic of justice both given and denied. Malcolm has walked these steps 100 times before, but today it feels different. His phone buzzes in his pocket, a soft vibration that pulls him from his thoughts. It's a message from Clarissa, his wife of nearly 30 years. She sent him a picture of their 2 grandchildren, both grinning ear to ear, holding up a homemade good luck charm. "Alicia made this for you." The text reads, "She says it'll keep you strong." Malcolm smiles, tucking the phone back into his jacket. His family is his grounding force, his reminder that everything he does inside those courthouse walls isn't just about cases or convictions, it's about the future he's trying to protect. As he reaches into the back seat to grab his leather briefcase, his fingers brush against the small, lopsided yarn charm Alicia made. It's bright blue, with knots unevenly tied by little hands, but its meaning? Immeasurable. He slips it into his jacket pocket, feeling its presence like a quiet promise. Today is just another day in the fight for justice. Or so he thinks. Across the street, parked beneath the shade of a sycamore, sits a black and white police cruiser. Inside, Officer Chad Rollins leans back in his seat, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed and watchful. Rollins is in his mid-30s, a man with a square jaw, close cropped brown hair, and a chip on his shoulder that seems to weigh as heavy as his duty belt. His partner, Mike Simmons, sits beside him, older, thicker around the middle, eyes tired from too many years chasing ghosts through these streets. Simmons glances at the file in his lap, uninterested, but Rollins? He's focused, scanning the block like a hawk, waiting for a reason. The radio crackles. A vague bolo, "Be on the lookout," echoes through the static. Black male, 40s, dark clothing, suspected in recent thefts downtown. No solid ID. No clear description. Just shadows. But shadows are enough for Officer Rollins. His eyes fix on Malcolm, stepping toward the courthouse. The tailored suit, the polished car, the confident walk, all of it should register as someone of stature, but Rollins doesn't see a prosecutor. He doesn't see the decades of hard work, the family, the fight for justice. He just sees the skin. "You see that guy?" Rollins mutters, tapping the window with the edge of his finger. Simmons glances up, frowns. "What about him?" Rollins leans forward, tension building behind his eyes. He matches. Simmons sighs, shakes his head. Matches half the attorneys in this city. But Rollins isn't listening. His hand moves to the door handle. The decision already made. Malcolm doesn't notice. Not yet. He's too focused on the steps ahead, on the courtroom waiting inside, on the case he's prepared to argue, a case that could change lives. But today, the argument won't happen where he expects. Today, the fight will begin long before the courtroom. Rollins steps out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt, squaring his shoulders like he's about to face off with a suspect. His steps are quick, purposeful, a predator moving toward prey. Simmons stays behind, staring after him, with the uneasy resignation of a man who's seen this before but never stepped in. The breeze shifts. The sun continues its climb. Charleston moves around them, unaware that in the space of a heartbeat, history is about to collide with prejudice once again, and Malcolm Pierce, the federal prosecutor, is about to walk straight into the storm. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." The words land sharp, like a slap cutting through the quiet Charleston morning. Malcolm Pierce turns, confused at first, blinking into the sunlight. As the officer's shadow stretches toward him across the cobblestones, his hand instinctively tightens around the handle of his leather briefcase. For a second, it doesn't register. This isn't a scene he's part of. This kind of thing happens to other people. "Excuse me?" Malcolm's voice is calm, steady, but there's a flicker of uncertainty in his chest. "I said, step away from the vehicle." Now, the officer's tone sharpens, snapping like a branch under pressure. Malcolm glances around. There's no misunderstanding here. No question about who the command is meant for, just him and the officer. The space between them suddenly feeling too small, too charged. Malcolm straightens his shoulders, placing his briefcase gently down on the passenger seat, his heart beginning to thud in his ears, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition. He's seen this play out before. He's argued cases about these exact moments. "I'm sorry, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice stays measured, polite, but the air thickens. The officer, Chad Rollins, closes the distance with a deliberate pace, eyes cold beneath the brim of his cap. His badge gleams in the morning light, but there's no honor shining behind it today. He's young, fueled by instinct rather than reason, and that instinct is screaming that Malcolm doesn't belong here. "You match the description of a suspect," Rollins replies flatly. "Step away from the car." Malcolm's brow furrows. His first instinct is to argue, to assert his authority, but he catches himself. He knows the rule book, knows the risks. Escalation first. Always a suspect in what? Rollins doesn't answer. His hand rests on his belt, fingers grazing the handcuffs clipped there, like a threat half-formed. Across the street, Officer Mike Simmons opens his door, stepping out of the cruiser slower, more hesitant. His hands hover at his sides, and his gaze flickers to the courthouse. He knows this is wrong. You can see it in the way his shoulders sag, in the heaviness behind his steps, but he doesn't stop it. By now, a few heads have turned. Pedestrians slow their steps. Conversations falter. There's a tension crackling in the air, and people feel it. They've seen this before. 2. Malcolm stays rooted, steady. "Officer, I am a federal prosecutor. I'm on my way into court." Rollins smirks, the kind of smirk that says, "I've heard that before. Then you won't mind answering a few questions." "I'm happy to answer anything," Malcolm replies, his voice low and even, "but I'd like to know what this is about." Rollins doesn't wait. He steps forward, hand moving toward his cuffs. "Turn around. Place your hands behind your back." The command hangs heavy in the air. Malcolm's breath catches in his throat. This isn't happening. Not here. Not now. He spent decades building a reputation, fighting for justice inside that courthouse. And yet, in this moment, none of it matters. I don't think you understand. I understand just fine, Rollins snaps, cutting him off. His hands are already reaching for Malcolm's arms. Malcolm's body stiffens. His eyes scan the street. More people are watching now. Phones are coming out. Cameras lifting into the air. A young woman across the street presses record on her phone, her lips parted in disbelief. The cold steel of the cuffs bites into Malcolm's wrists. The metallic click ringing out louder than the distant seagulls overhead. His briefcase tumbles to the ground, landing with a hollow thud that echoes off the courthouse steps. And there, spilling out from the half-open zipper, lies the little blue yarn charm his granddaughter made him that morning. A soft thing, innocent, out of place against the hard gray pavement. Officer Simmons shifts his weight from one foot to the other. His hands fidget, his eyes darting between Malcolm's face and Rollins' clenched jaw. You can see it in Simmons' eyes, the regret, the doubt, but still, he says nothing. Malcolm stands tall, even with his hands bound behind his back. His gaze meets Rollins directly. "You're making a mistake." Rollins gives a sharp tug on the cuffs, steering Malcolm toward the patrol car. "We'll see." The courthouse, just steps away, looms large in the background, watching silently as one of its own is led away like a criminal. Behind the tall windows, Judge Evelyn Monroe watches from her chambers. She leans forward, squinting, her heart catching in her throat. She knows that man. She knows his work, his reputation, his heart. But all she sees now is the outline of a black man being pushed into the back of a squad car. Outside, the crowd thickens. The murmurs grow louder. "What did he do?" someone asks. "Nothing," another voice answers. "Nothing but exist." Malcolm lowers himself into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut behind him. The cuffs dig into his skin. His breathing slows, steady but deliberate. He spent years studying these moments, reading the transcripts, examining the body cam footage, arguing the cases, but now he's living it. Now he's the evidence. Officer Rollins slides into the driver's seat, glancing at Malcolm in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. Simmons climbs in beside him, staring at his hands, unable to meet Malcolm's eyes. "You're awful quiet back there," Rollins says, as if Malcolm's silence is some kind of admission. But Malcolm doesn't respond. His gaze is fixed forward, his mind already turning, collecting every detail, every word, every misstep. He knows how this works, knows what's coming next. But he also knows something Rollins doesn't. He knows that this moment, the one Rollins thinks he controls, is about to unravel in ways no one saw coming. The squad car pulls away from the curb, crawling down East Bay Street. The courthouse fades behind them, but its shadow lingers. And somewhere in the distance, the first ripple of outrage begins. A quiet wave that will soon become a storm. The squad car idled at the corner of East Bay and Broad, but the city of Charleston wasn't the same as it had been 10 minutes ago. The morning still glowed soft with sunlight, but the air had thickened, charged with disbelief, tension, and something else. The stirrings of outrage. The first person to notice was an older black man standing outside the coffee shop on the corner, his cup frozen halfway to his lips as he stared across the street. He'd watched the scene unfold from the moment Officer Rollins crossed the street. At first, he thought maybe it was just a conversation, maybe a question about parking or directions. But then he saw the cuffs, saw Malcolm Pierce's briefcase hit the ground, heard the metallic snap echo off the courthouse walls. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. What the hell? Inside the coffee shop, a young woman, early 20s, hair pulled back in a tight bun, earbuds dangling loose, stood from her seat. She'd caught it too. The way Malcolm stood tall, how he didn't resist, how the officer still grabbed his arms like he was a threat. Her hands trembled, as she reached for her phone. "Is anyone seeing this?" she whispered, opening her camera app. A few steps down the block, another pedestrian paused mid-stride. Then another. Conversations slowed, heads turned, the rhythm of the morning disrupted. The sight of a black man in a suit being stuffed into the back of a patrol car, it didn't belong here. Not in front of the federal courthouse. Not in broad daylight. But here it was, and it demanded attention. The young woman outside the coffee shop hit record. "Yo, look at this," she muttered under her breath, narrating to no one and everyone. "This man's wearing a suit. They're arresting him like he's a criminal. Didn't see him do a thing." Inside the patrol car, Malcolm sat still, his eyes locked on the horizon. His hands tingled from the cuffs, wrists bruising against the steel, but his mind wasn't on the pain. It was on the moment. He could feel the weight of every gaze. Every camera lens turned his way. He knew how these things spun, how quickly the narrative could shift. Suspect detained. Black male, late 40s. Fit the description. End of story. But this wasn't the end. Not for Malcolm. Not today. Officer Rollins checked the rearview mirror again, catching Malcolm's gaze. "You better wipe that look off your face," Rollins muttered, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Malcolm didn't blink. Behind them, a low buzz started to ripple through the crowd. Conversations turned into questions. Who is he? What happened? Why didn't they even ask him for ID? The young woman's video streamed live now. Dozens tuned in within seconds. Hundreds within minutes. Comments rolled in beneath the footage. "He didn't even resist. Did that cop just cuff him for standing there? Why is he wearing a suit if he's a suspect?" It wasn't long before the clip jumped from phones to social feeds. The tags began. Hashtag Charleston Courthouse. Hashtag profiling in progress. Hashtag justice for Malcolm. But no one knew his name yet. He was just that man in the suit until someone recognized him. A clerk inside the courthouse peered through the window, eyes widening in shock. "That's Malcolm Pierce!" she gasped, turning to her colleague. "The federal prosecutor," her voice caught in her throat. "What the hell are they doing?" Inside her chambers, Judge Evelyn Monroe stood frozen, watching from her window. She knew Malcolm's walk, knew the quiet authority he carried into her courtroom. She'd watched him argue cases with precision and grace, holding power accountable like few others could. And now, she watched him shoved into a squad car like he was nothing, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Back on the street, the crowd thickened. Cell phones lifted higher. More voices joined the low murmur of disbelief. It wasn't just a scene anymore, it was a spectacle. "Did you see what he did?" someone asked. "Does it matter?" another snapped back. Inside the patrol car, Malcolm exhaled slowly, measuring every breath. His heart pounded, but his face stayed calm. His mind cataloged every second. The officer's tone, the way he grabbed him without explanation, the crowd, the cameras, the witnesses. He knew this wouldn't just be a story about him. It would be about the system, about every time a black man was told to keep his hands visible. Every time someone was assumed guilty for fitting a description. He'd argued this reality in courtrooms for decades. But now, he was the evidence. The squad car crawled forward, turning onto Broad Street, but the crowd followed. Feet shuffled along the sidewalks, eyes still trained on the scene. Phones stayed up, recording from every angle. Even the tourists had stopped snapping photos of pastel houses and turned their lenses toward something real. Inside the car, Officer Simmons cleared his throat. His hands gripped his knees, his eyes flicking nervously toward the mirror. He knew this wasn't right. He'd felt it from the start, but silence was easier. It always was. "You really should have just stayed quiet," Rollins muttered, as if that solved everything. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any argument. Behind them, The young woman's live stream spiked past 1,000 viewers. Then 2,000. Her voice trembled as she spoke. They just arrested a black man in front of the courthouse. He didn't do anything, didn't resist. They just grabbed him. The comments flew faster now. Where's his ID? Did they even ask? This is why we film. Anybody know who he is? And then someone did. A local reporter watching the feed typed 4 words that changed everything. That's Malcolm Pierce. Prosecutor. The comment pinned itself to the top of the stream, and suddenly the video wasn't just another clip of police overreach, it was a spark, a match against dry timber. Because this wasn't a suspect. This wasn't someone unknown. This was a man sworn to uphold the law, now crushed beneath it. Inside the courthouse, Judge Monroe turned away from the window, her jaw tight. She reached for her phone, her mind racing. She wouldn't let this stand. Not here. Not in her courthouse. Outside, the city moved slower now. The streets buzzed, not with traffic, but with the weight of something undeniable. The world had begun to watch. And Malcolm Pierce, hands cuffed, wrists bruised, head held high, knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors echoed with the steady rhythm of routine clerks shuffling papers, attorneys murmuring strategy, judges flipping through case files. But the tension outside had begun to seep through the stone walls. The energy shifted. People paused mid-conversation, heads turned toward the front entrance. Something was happening, and it wasn't part of anyone's docket. Judge Evelyn Monroe stood at the window in her chambers, staring down at the squad car as it pulled away. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled at her sides. She'd been a judge long enough to know how power worked, how assumptions could twist facts before they ever reached her bench. But this wasn't some distant story in the news. This was her courthouse. This was Malcolm Pierce. She turned sharply, reaching for the phone on her desk, punching in the number for the intake office without hesitation. The line buzzed twice before connecting. Elaine, Judge Monroe snapped, her voice sharp, controlled, but tinged with anger. Is Malcolm Pierce down there? Elaine, a clerk in her late 50s with a mind like a steel trap, paused, confused. Judge Monroe? No, I haven't. Find him. Monroe cut in. Right now. I want to know exactly what's going on. Meanwhile, downstairs in the courthouse's intake processing room, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow on the plain white walls. The air felt heavy with something unspoken. The 2 federal marshals stationed at the security checkpoint leaned in, exchanging glances, as Officer Rollins strode through the metal detectors, Malcolm Pierce in tow. Malcolm's hands were still cuffed behind his back, but his spine remained straight, his chin lifted, dignity intact. One of the marshals, Torres, a sharp-eyed Latino officer in his early 30s, straightened. His gaze narrowed as he took in Malcolm's familiar face, the sharp lines of his suit, the calm defiance in his eyes. He stepped forward. Rollins, Torres called out, his voice firm but questioning. You sure about this? Rollins barely broke stride, picked him up outside. He fits the description. Torres raised an eyebrow. That's Malcolm Pierce. He's federal. You sure you want to walk him through here like that? Rollins didn't flinch. If he's federal, he'll be cleared soon enough. Torres exchanged another glance with his partner, but said nothing more. The elevator dinged softly as Rollins pressed the button for the 3rd floor. Where intake processing sat, the ride up felt suffocating. Malcolm stood between Rollins and Simmons, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. The faint buzz of the elevator motor seemed louder than it should have. Rollins glanced over at Malcolm, eyes cold. Not so talkative now, huh? Malcolm didn't respond. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his breath slow and measured. He was thinking, calculating. Every second of this encounter would be logged, every word stored away like evidence. in a case he would argue later not as a prosecutor but as a victim. When the doors slid open, the intake clerk, Elaine, looked up from her desk. Her eyes landed on Malcolm immediately, and her brow creased. She knew that face. Everyone in this courthouse knew Malcolm Pierce. She stood abruptly. "Missed." "Pierce?" Her voice caught, equal parts confusion and alarm. Before Rollins could say anything, Malcolm spoke. "Elaine, would you please call Judge Monroe in her chambers? Tell her Malcolm Pierce is here." Urgently, Rollins stepped forward, chest puffed. "This man is being detained. You'll need to stay out of this." Elaine didn't even blink. She raised a hand, silencing him. "Officer, the first suggest you stop talking before this gets worse." Simmons shifted uncomfortably beside Rollins, his hands fidgeting again, his eyes darting around the room. His silence screamed louder. With each passing second, Elaine lifted the receiver and dialed swiftly. "Judge Monroe's chambers, please," she said, her voice steady but clipped. "This is intake. Malcolm Pierce is here. Yes, cuffed. You need to come now." The click of the phone hitting the receiver echoed through the small room. Rollins opened his mouth to protest again, but the words never came. The authority in Elaine's tone left no room for debate. Moments later, the heavy footsteps of Judge Monroe rang down the hall, each step sharp and purposeful. She burst through the intake room door like a storm. Her robe trailed behind her, and her eyes burned with a quiet fury. She stopped dead at the sight of Malcolm in cuffs. Her face tightened, but her voice came out calm, controlled. "Take those off." Now, Rollins didn't move. His jaw clenched, his eyes flicking between Malcolm and the judge. "I said now, officer," Monroe repeated, each word deliberate, each syllable slicing the air like a blade. Rollins hesitated, his pride battling the weight of her authority. But eventually, he stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs with a sharp metallic click. The steel released from Malcolm's wrists, leaving red marks in its place. Malcolm rubbed his wrists slowly, nodding once in silent thanks. "I thought you'd be in court by now," Monroe said, her voice softening as she turned to Malcolm. "I was on my way," he replied, voice low but steady. Monroe's gaze shifted back to Rollins, her eyes narrowing. "On what grounds did you detain him?" Rollins stiffened. "Blackmail, 40s, dark clothing, near the scene of recent burglaries? That's it?" Monroe's voice dropped, icy. "It was enough to stop him. And was it enough to cuff him?" Her tone sharpened, slicing the space between them. "I followed procedure," Rollins muttered, his jaw tight. "No," Monroe snapped back. "You followed prejudice." The words hit hard. Simmons shifted again, his face pale. "Officer Simmons?" Monroe's gaze pinned him in place. "You stood there, said nothing. Care to add anything now?" Simmons swallowed hard, his throat working around the words he couldn't form. Monroe turned back to Elaine. "Get the U.S. Marshal Service. I want security footage, internal communications, every piece of documentation on this." She turned to Malcolm. "Would you like to press charges?" Malcolm paused, breathing deep, feeling the weight of the moment, the eyes in the room, the expectation. "Not yet," he said softly, "but I'd like to speak. On the record." "Here." Monroe nodded once. "You'll have it." And with that, Malcolm Pierce turned back toward the courthouse hall, not as a man in cuffs, not as a suspect, but as the spark of a fire no one could put out. The storm had arrived. The courtroom filled slowly at first, just a few clerks lingering outside the door, whispering about what they'd seen downstairs. Then word spread, and it spread fast, not because a crime had been committed, but because everyone knew who had been cuffed and marched through the courthouse lobby like a suspect: Malcolm Pierce. The name wasn't just familiar, it carried weight here. 20 years as a federal prosecutor. The man who'd put away corrupt city officials, brought down drug rings, argued in front of this very bench for justice over and over again. And now, he wasn't seated where the prosecutors sit. He wasn't at the bench. He was standing at the defense table, adjusting the lapel of his navy suit like it was armor. The room felt charged. Lawyers leaned in close behind manila folders, pretending not to eavesdrop. Court reporters set up a little faster than usual, fingers poised above their keys. Even a few senior DOJ officials slipped into the back row, silent observers, not because there was a trial, but because there was about to be a reckoning. Judge Evelyn Monroe swept into the room through the side door, her black robe billowing behind her like storm clouds. She took her seat at the bench, gavel in hand, but she didn't strike it right away. She let the weight of the silence settle first. This session, she began, her voice calm but edged with steel, is being held on the record at the request of Mr. 29, Malcolm Pierce, Assistant United States Attorney for the District of South Carolina. This is not a trial, but, she paused, eyes scanning the room. It may become one. Her gaze shifted to Malcolm. Mr. Pierce, you may speak. Malcolm stood slowly, the microphone buzzing faintly as he adjusted it. He looked out across the room, catching every eye turned toward him. No notes, no prepared statement, just the truth. Your Honor, Malcolm began, voice even but strong. Earlier today, I was arrested without cause, in full view of this courthouse, by Officer Chad Rollins of the Charleston Police Department. There was a shuffle of movement in the gallery. Malcolm let it pass, then continued. I was not asked to identify myself. I was not read my rights. I was told I fit a description so vague it could apply to hundreds of men in this city, hundreds of black men. He paused. His eyes scanned the gallery again. Officer Rollins stood across the aisle, arms folded, jaw tight, defiant, his uniform crisp, badge gleaming, but not a flicker of regret behind those eyes. I was cuffed, searched, paraded across the courthouse steps like a criminal, Malcolm continued, his voice never rising but filling the room with weight, and I remained calm. I didn't resist. I cooperated. Why? Because I knew that if I didn't, I might not live long enough to explain myself. That line hit the courtroom like a hammer. The silence cracked. Somewhere near the back, someone sucked in a sharp breath. A younger attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Malcolm took a steady breath, then went on, I've spent my career prosecuting gang leaders, corrupt officials, predators hiding behind privilege. And in all that time, I never imagined I'd be mistaken for a suspect simply for existing in the wrong skin at the wrong place, wearing the wrong suit. Rollins shifted. His jaw worked side to side, but he stayed silent. Malcolm turned slightly, facing him directly. You didn't see a prosecutor, Officer Rollins. You saw a black man standing beside a nice car. Monroe leaned forward. Mr. Pierce, I will allow this line of argument for now. Malcolm nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned back to the room. But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been presumed guilty before they've even spoken. Every parent who's had to teach their children to raise their hands, lower their voice, and pray they're seen as human. He paused again, letting the weight settle. His hands rested calmly on the table, but his knuckles were white against the wood. If I didn't have a badge in my wallet, he added softly, I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be in a holding cell, or worse. The room was stone silent, the kind of silence that carries weight, that presses against your chest. Judge Monroe leaned back, her eyes steady. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Pierce, your words are noted for the record. She turned to Rollins. Officer Rollins, do you wish to respond? Rollins stepped forward, his posture stiff, his voice flat. I was following procedure, Your Honor. The suspect's description matched Mr. Pierce. Monroe's brow lifted slightly. State the description. Officer. Rollins cleared his throat, reading from a note card. Black male. 40s. Dark clothing. Seen leaving the vicinity of recent burglaries downtown? That's it? Malcolm asked quietly. No height. No identifying marks? No vehicle make or model? Rollins hesitated. That was all dispatch provided. Monroe nodded slowly, her voice colder now. And yet you felt confident enough to arrest a man in front of a federal courthouse. Without even asking his name, I acted on instinct. Rollins replied. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed calm. Instinct isn't a defense, officer. Not when instinct is bias wrapped in a uniform. Rollins' jaw clenched tighter. Beside him, Officer Simmons shifted again. His eyes dropped to the floor. Officer Simmons, Monroe addressed him directly. Do you have anything to add? Simmons swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. Your Honor. I recognized Mr. Pierce. I knew who he was. The words sent a ripple through the gallery. You knew who I was, Malcolm repeated softly, and you let him cuff me. Simmons' hands trembled slightly. I didn't think it would go that far. I didn't think. But here we are, Monroe cut in, her voice sharp. The room sat frozen. No one moved. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Malcolm sat down, his heart pounding beneath his calm exterior. His hands rested on the table, steady now, as if they'd absorbed every word spoken. Across from him, Rollins stood like a statue, his arms folded tighter, but the cracks were showing. Monroe looked out over the room, her eyes hard, her voice steady. Let this moment be clear. This courtroom is not a place for assumptions. It is a place for facts. And today the facts are ugly. She turned back to Malcolm. Mr. Pierce, you have every right to file formal charges. Malcolm met her gaze. I'm not done yet, because this wasn't just about charges. This wasn't just about today. This was about every day that came before it, and every day that would come after. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a wave receding from the shore, quiet, deliberate, leaving behind an echo of what had just unfolded. People filed out without their usual chatter, without the shuffle of papers or idle small talk. There were no sideways glances, no half smiles, just silence. Heavy, thick silence. Malcolm Pierce stayed seated at the defense table long after the gavel struck. His hands rested flat against the wood, fingertips pressing into the grain like he could anchor himself there. His heart still beat hard beneath his suit jacket, but outwardly, he showed no sign of it. That was the thing about being a black man in these rooms. Control wasn't just a skill. It was survival. Across the empty gallery, Officer Simmons hesitated at the doorway, glancing back once before leaving. His shoulders sagged as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had only now started to crush him. Rollins didn't linger. He stormed out of the courtroom without looking back, his jaw set, his pride wounded, but the walls had recorded everything, the cameras, the transcripts, the eyes of those who had watched it all unfold. None of it could be taken back. Malcolm rose slowly, rolling his shoulders beneath the weight of the morning, the weight of the years. This wasn't over. It wasn't close to over. He knew that. Outside, the Charleston sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. The square was crowded now not with tourists or passers-by, but with cameras. News vans lined the curb. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones aimed like weapons at the courthouse door. Somewhere in the sea of bodies, the young woman who had live-streamed Malcolm's arrest stood with her phone in hand, the red light blinking as her feed rolled on. The headline had already taken shape. Federal prosecutor arrested outside Charleston Courthouse for fitting the description. But Malcolm didn't walk out the front. He took the side exit, slipping quietly into the alley between the courthouse and the adjacent municipal building. His steps echoed softly off the brick walls, his body moving on instinct now, tracing the path he needed most, not toward the cameras, but toward home. When he reached his front door, the house was still, too still. The blinds were drawn halfway, the morning light casting faint slats across the wooden floor of the foyer. His briefcase felt heavier in his hand now, even though the only thing inside it was a legal pad and a child's blue yarn charm. Clarissa was in the kitchen, still dressed in the soft green scrubs she'd worn through her night shift at the hospital. She stood at the stove, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Her eyes lifted as Malcolm entered, and for a second, they didn't speak. She crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his chest. He felt the tension melt from her body as she held him tighter, breathing in the scent of the morning, the courthouse, the dust, the quiet rage that clung to his skin. "You didn't deserve that," she whispered, her voice muffled against his suit. Malcolm rested his chin gently on her head. "I know, but it wasn't enough." The words felt hollow. Clarissa pulled back, looking up into his face. "It's not just about you," he nodded once. He knew what she meant. It never was. "You've worked too hard, Malcolm," she said softly. "You've stood in that courthouse for years, fighting for other people. And they still," her voice cracked, but she didn't finish. "She didn't need to." "I know," he said again, but this time, his voice wavered. Clarissa turned, refilling her coffee mug, though she didn't drink it. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, his body slumping for the first time all day. He loosened his tie, letting it hang undone around his collar. "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do," Clarissa pressed gently. "You always know." He glanced at the legal pad in his briefcase, the little blue yarn charm peeking out from beneath it. Alicia's gift, simple but powerful. It sat there like a reminder that he wasn't just fighting for himself. Clarissa moved closer, leaning one hand on the back of his chair. "You think you're not a symbol," she said softly, "but you are. Whether you like it or not, people are watching." Malcolm let out a long sigh, running a hand over his face. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," she whispered, "but that doesn't change what's happening. And it doesn't change what you mean to people." The silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds a question, a choice. "I just wanted to do my job," Malcolm said finally. "I just wanted to walk into court." Clarissa reached out, took his hand. "That's exactly why you have to speak." He didn't answer, not right away, but the decision had already started to take shape. By afternoon, the videos had gone viral. The footage from the young woman's phone, the courthouse security feed, different angles, different perspectives, but all telling the same story. Cable news anchors debated over the legality of the arrest, filling the airwaves with talking heads, each spouting their opinion. Conservative pundits insisted Rollins had just been doing his job. Progressives demanded his badge, but one clip rose above the noise. A live stream from a law clerk, someone inside the courthouse, had captured the exact moment Judge Monroe ordered Malcolm's release. The clip didn't show the arrest. It didn't show the confrontation. It showed the truth. The look on Rollins' face as the cuffs were unlocked, the steady calm in Malcolm's eyes as he rubbed his wrists. That clip hit 3 million views by sundown. Clarissa turned the television off before the commentators could start shouting over each other. She looked over at Malcolm, who sat at the dining room table, papers spread out in front of him, the little blue charm resting on top. "David Lyle called," she said quietly. Malcolm looked up. "He wants you at the press conference. Tomorrow." "Said it's your call." Malcolm nodded slowly. "It's not about the cameras." "No," Clarissa agreed. "It's about the story. About who gets to tell it." Malcolm sat there for a long time after she went to bed, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. His hands rested on the table, but his mind was somewhere else. By the time he rose, the decision was clear. This wasn't about asking permission. It was about standing up for himself, for his daughter, for every man who'd ever been told they were guilty before they even spoke. Tomorrow, he'd speak. The press conference was a blur. The lights, the cameras, The steady hum of reporters firing off questions like darts. Malcolm Pierce stood at the podium, in the same navy suit he wore the day of the arrest. No tie, this time, just his nameplate, his voice, and the truth. The Department of Justice's seal loomed behind him, a quiet reminder of the institution he'd spent his life defending. "I wasn't alone," Malcolm had said, voice steady, words slicing through the noise. "I carried every black man who has ever had to explain his presence, every father who's feared that staying alive meant staying silent." By the time the press conference ended, the room erupted into a wall of questions. Malcolm answered a few, sidestepped others. But when the flashbulbs kept popping and the air turned suffocating, he slipped out the back. No applause, no pats on the back, just the quiet alley behind the DOJ's local office. But waiting for him, there wasn't silence. "Malcolm," the voice stopped him in his tracks. Soft, familiar, but worn thin by regret. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the last person he expected to see, Officer Mike Simmons, dressed in plain clothes, no badge, no duty belt, just an old brown jacket, jeans, and a folder tucked under one arm. His stance was awkward, shoulders hunched, like a man carrying the weight of his own silence. "I wasn't sure I should come," Simmons muttered, eyes darting down to the concrete. Malcolm didn't move, didn't speak, his fists clenched at his sides, fingers curling tighter with each passing second. Simmons swallowed hard, then stepped forward, holding out the folder like a peace offering. "I owe you more than silence." Malcolm stared at it, then back at Simmons. His voice was low, sharp. "You knew who I was." A beat. Then another. Simmons nodded, shame darkening his eyes. "Yeah, I knew." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "And you still stood there." Simmons' hand shook slightly as he extended the folder farther. "I don't expect forgiveness." Malcolm stayed rooted, the air between them heavy, charged. "Just open it," Simmons said softly. After a long pause, Malcolm reached out and took the folder. His hands were steady as he flipped it open, but his heart pounded hard enough to echo in his ears. Inside, neatly stacked, were printed emails, internal memos, and something darker, a spreadsheet. He scanned the top page. Reports filed against Officer Rollins. 7 of them. Different dates, different names. All dismissed. All buried. "You've been saving this?" Malcolm asked, his voice flat. Simmons nodded once. "For months. I thought maybe I was imagining it at first. Thought maybe I was making it worse in my head. And yesterday?" Malcolm's eyes didn't lift from the page. "Yesterday I realized I wasn't imagining anything," Simmons answered. "I realized I was part of the problem." Malcolm turned the page. The spreadsheet chilled him more than the words. 32 names. All black men. All stopped under vague suspicions by Rollins. Only 2 ever charged. Both cases dropped. The last column read suppress and archive. Malcolm's pulse slowed, but the rage beneath it burned hotter. Simmons shifted uncomfortably, his voice a rough whisper. "There's more." A shared folder between some of the officers, a nickname, they gave it the shadow docket. Photos, addresses, people flagged for curring attention, mostly black men, certain neighborhoods, certain vehicles. Malcolm finally looked up, his eyes cutting through Simmons like glass. "Profiling?" Simmons nodded grimly. "I didn't want to believe it, but it's there, and you let it happen." Malcolm shot back, his voice razor sharp. "You stood by." Simmons nodded again, swallowing hard. "I know." Malcolm's jaw worked, grinding against the weight of his fury. "You think handing me this makes it right?" Simmons shook his head. "No, it doesn't. I'm not asking for that. I'm giving you the match." "Burn it down." The words hung heavy between them. Malcolm stared at the folder for a long moment, then snapped it closed with finality. "I'm going to." He turned to leave, the weight of the folder under his arm, now heavier than any briefcase. But Simmons' voice followed him. "There's something else," Simmons added, his voice softer now. "It's not just Rollins. The DA's office knows. They've been shielding him, shielding all of it." Malcolm stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Simmons nodded once. "Fallner. He knows. He's covered for Rollins more times than I can count." Malcolm didn't respond. He couldn't. Not yet. His mind spun, cataloging the information, fitting it into the puzzle of what he already knew. Simmons took a hesitant step forward. "I can get more. There are messages, logs. I know how to find them." Malcolm turned back, staring hard into Simmons' eyes. For the first time since the arrest, something flickered there. Not forgiveness, but possibility. "Do it," Malcolm said. Simmons nodded once, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the alley like a ghost. A man finally breaking the silence that had shielded injustice for far too long. Malcolm stood there for a long moment, his breath steady, the folder pressing into his side like a promise. By the time he walked out of that alley and into the Charleston streets, the city had changed again. The news cycle was already spinning, but the story wasn't finished. The videos had gone viral. The world was watching. And now? Now Malcolm had more than outrage. He had evidence. Evidence that could burn it all down. The next morning, Malcolm Pierce stood in front of the Department of Justice Oversight Board. It wasn't a courtroom, not officially, but it felt like one. Rows of polished wooden desks stretched out in front of him. Suits filled every chair, their expressions carefully neutral, hands folded, pens poised, but ready to scribble at the first sign of controversy. On one side of the room sat the brass from Charleston PD. On the other, federal observers, civil rights advocates, and legal minds. Malcolm knew well some allies, some skeptics. They all wore the same mask of calm, but beneath it, everyone knew this wasn't just another review session. This was a powder keg. Malcolm adjusted the microphone in front of him, laying a single folder on the desk, like it was a grenade. The weight of what sat inside wasn't lost on anyone. "I want to thank the board for convening this hearing," Malcolm began, his voice steady, measured, "but let me be clear. I'm not here to tell a story. I'm here to expose a pattern." He opened the folder. Inside were the documents Officer Simmons had given him, the suppressed reports, the spreadsheet, the evidence that had been buried. "These are 7 complaints filed against Officer Chad Rollins over the last 4 years," Malcolm continued, flipping to the first page. "Each one involves the unlawful stop and detention of black men in Charleston. Each time, the suspects fit vague descriptions. Each time, the complaints were dismissed." "Buried?" A murmur rippled through the room. Malcolm didn't pause. "This isn't coincidence. This isn't poor training. This is cultural permission. And it has to end." From the front row, Chief Leonard Brooks of the Charleston PD cleared his throat, an older man with sharp features and a carefully rehearsed smile. Brooks had led the department for a decade. His face stayed calm, but his hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. Malcolm looked directly at him. "Chief Brooks, when was the last time Officer Rollins underwent any training related to racial profiling or constitutional procedure?" Brooks straightened his spine. "I'd have to check the records." "I already did," Malcolm interrupted, flipping another page. "Not once in the last 5 years. In fact, your department removed implicit bias training from your budget proposal in 2021. Brooks stiffened. "We redirected those funds to tactical preparedness programs." "So you cut funding for education," Malcolm replied flatly, "and redirected it to more guns." The room tensed. A younger officer near the back shifted in his seat. Clearing his throat, Malcolm pressed on. "I'm also submitting a sworn statement from Officer Michael Simmons, Rollins' partner." He held up another document. "He confirms witnessing multiple unlawful stops, racial profiling. He admits to remaining silent." Brooks shook his head, his smile fading. This is turning into a witch hunt. Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. With all due respect, Chief, if your department is Salem, I'm not the one lighting the fire. You are. The words landed hard. Across the room, one of the federal observers scribbled furiously in her notepad. Malcolm flipped to the final page, steady and deliberate. I'm not here today to press personal charges against Officer Rollins. Not yet, because I don't want another settlement. I don't want hush money or headlines that fade away in a week. He leaned forward, his voice sharpening. I want reform. Public, enforceable, permanent reform. The room held its breath. Judge Evelyn Monroe, seated quietly as a neutral observer near the back, raised an eyebrow. Do you have a specific proposal, Mr. Pierce? Malcolm nodded once, turning back to face the panel. Yes. 3 demands. He held up one finger. First, mandatory annual training for every officer in Charleston PD on racial profiling, constitutional procedure, and de-escalation. A second finger. Second, the creation of a civilian oversight board with subpoena power. And then a third, the immediate suspension of any officer under investigation for misconduct, pending a full review. The murmurs in the room grew louder. One of the younger officials leaned over to whisper to the chair of the board. Malcolm looked around the room, his gaze steady, unwavering. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to rebuild. But if the system won't change itself, then I will take every camera, every court, every voice I can find, and I will make Charleston a national case study on how power responds to injustice. He gathered his papers, stood tall, and delivered his closing line with the force of a gavel. You have a choice. Either this city becomes a symbol of change or a warning. With that, Malcolm turned, leaving the folder behind on the table as he walked out. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sound bouncing off the polished marble walls. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting sharp shadows across the courthouse steps. Reporters waited there too, their microphones ready. Malcolm didn't stop. He didn't need to speak again. The evidence spoke for itself. And now, so did the city. Washington, D.C. felt different. The air carried a weight here, a kind of expectation that hovered over every marble hallway, every polished nameplate, every seat in the Senate hearing chamber. It wasn't Malcolm Pierce's first time walking these corridors. He'd been here before, quietly advising subcommittees, briefing senators on legal strategy, offering insights from the background. But today wasn't the background. Today, he was the headline. The seal of the United States Senate loomed behind him. As he took his seat at the witness table, microphones pointed at his chest. CSPANs. Red light glowing steadily from the back of the room. The press sat lined along the back wall, their pens poised like bayonets, eyes sharp, hungry. Senators lined the dais, some leaning forward, some leaning back, but all watching. Malcolm sat alone at the table, his papers neatly stacked, the small blue yarn charm his granddaughter made resting on top. It was there for him, not for the cameras. A quiet anchor. Senator Maya Hill, chair of the Judiciary Committee, sat at the center of the panel, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. She leaned into her microphone, her voice steady. Mr. Pierce, thank you for being here today. You've submitted documentation related to an unofficial list, maintained between local law enforcement and the Charleston District Attorney's Office. You've testified that this list disproportionately targets black citizens without probable cause. Is that correct? Malcolm adjusted the mic in front of him, his hands steady. That is correct, Senator. Hill nodded, her gaze sharp. Do you have evidence that this practice was known beyond the local DA's office? Malcolm reached for his folder, flipping to the first page, lifting it for the clerk. This, he said, holding up a printed email, is correspondence from the National Association of District Attorneys, dated March 2022. It references a pilot program titled Predictive Suspect Monitoring, shared across 7 states including Georgia and South Carolina. He handed it to the clerk, who delivered it to the panel. The room tensed. Eyes shifted. Several senators exchanged glances. Malcolm continued. The program uses historical arrest data to flag individuals as recurring subjects of interest, but the data itself is tainted. Over 75% of those flagged are Black or Hispanic, despite making up less than 40% of the total population in the participating counties. Senator Hill leaned forward, her expression darkening. "You're saying this isn't just a Charleston problem?" Malcolm looked her dead in the eye. "It's systemic." The words dropped into the chamber like a stone into still water. The ripples were immediate. Gasps echoed through the gallery. One senator scribbled furiously in the margins of his notes. Another adjusted his tie, his face tightening. Senator William Pratt, an old guard conservative from Texas, cleared his throat and leaned forward, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Mr. Pierce," he drawled, "do you believe this was intentional misconduct or simply a bureaucratic oversight that got out of hand?" Malcolm didn't flinch. His response came fast, certain. "Senator, if I profile 30 Black men in one city and nobody stops me, that's an oversight. But if I do it 30 more times and they build a spreadsheet to help me do it faster, that's policy." Pratt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing more. Senator Hill picked up the thread again, her voice low, controlled. "Have any other jurisdictions confirmed the existence of these lists?" Malcolm nodded once. "Since my initial testimony went public, I've received encrypted messages from 4 other prosecutors, one in Missouri, one in North Carolina, one in Ohio, and one in Arizona. They were told to suppress complaints, to archive cases without cause. They were told to stand down. The room froze. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated for half a second before resuming. Hill leaned back, her voice quieter now, but no less sharp. "Mr. Pierce, what would you call this?" Malcolm didn't blink. His answer cut clean and true. "A slow-motion constitutional collapse." The chamber erupted not with noise, but with tension. Senators leaned in, some whispering hurriedly to their aides. The press scribbled faster, their pens scratching like static across their notepads. Hill straightened again, her tone shifting from inquiry to resolve. "And you believe these data-driven practices, this so-called predictive suspect monitoring, are knowingly being used to justify unconstitutional stops?" Malcolm's voice stayed calm, but his words sharpened. "Yes, and worse. They've built policy around it. They use bias to feed the algorithm, then use the algorithm to excuse their bias." Across the dais, the faces shifted, some pale, some stone-faced, but none unaffected. One senator, a freshman from Illinois, leaned forward, his voice steady but soft. "Mr. Pierce, do you fear retaliation for this testimony?" Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. "I expect it." He paused, then added more softly, "But that fear doesn't outweigh the truth." Senator Hill leaned into her microphone again. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. This committee will move to secure all documentation provided and will review the broader implications for national policy." But Malcolm wasn't done. "There's one more thing," he said, lifting a final page from his folder. "This is an internal memo from Charleston's DA's office. It outlines a quiet agreement between senior law enforcement and the district attorney to manage public optics regarding minority stops." He paused, then added, "In plain terms, sweep it under the rug." The memo passed down the line, each senator flipping through it, the words sparking fresh anger in their eyes. Outside the hearing room, the buzz had already begun. The press was streaming the session live. Hashtags flooded social media. Commentators were already dissecting every word. Bias-fed algorithms. Systemic profiling. A prosecutor who refused to stay silent But inside the chamber, Malcolm Pierce sat steady, hands folded, gaze unwavering. He wasn't the background anymore. He was the front line. The committee recessed, the senators filing out one by one, their aides swarming, their phones lighting up. But Malcolm stayed seated for a moment longer. His fingers brushed the little blue yarn charm at the edge of his folder. Outside those doors, the battle would rage on commentators, arguing, politicians spinning. But here, inside this room, the truth had been spoken, and it couldn't be taken back. Malcolm stood, gathered his papers, and walked out of the chamber, not with the swagger of victory, but with the steady purpose of a man who knows the fight is far from over. The courthouse in Charleston looked different now. Not in structure, its columns still stood tall, its marble still gleamed in the Carolina sun, but the air had shifted. The weight of the hearings, the evidence, the eyes of the nation pressing down on this one place it was everywhere. The courthouse had become something more than a building. It had become a mirror, and inside, for one final hearing, every seat was filled. The largest chamber in the district, usually reserved for high-profile federal trials, buzzed with quiet anticipation. Reporters packed the back rows, pens tapping nervously against notepads. Civil rights lawyers, community activists, local leaders all sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the front of the room. And there stood Malcolm Pierce, no longer seated at a prosecutor's table, no longer just a witness. Today he stood at the center of it all, not as a man defending himself, but as a petitioner calling for the soul of the justice system itself. Behind him sat a patchwork of faces, black men and women who had appeared on Charleston's unofficial list, people who had been stopped, questioned, handcuffed, and forgotten. They weren't names in a spreadsheet anymore. They were here, watching, and tucked in the back corner, almost hidden by the crowd, sat Officer Mike Simmons. No badge, no uniform, just a worn-out man holding a flash drive in his lap, his jaw clenched, his eyes steady. Between him and Malcolm, there was history. Between them now, there was purpose. At the bench, presiding over it all, sat Judge Evelyn Monroe. Except today, she wasn't alone. A visiting federal judge from Washington had been brought in to oversee the scope of this unprecedented hearing. Judge Evelyn Whitaker. She was sharp-eyed, black, with a reputation for cutting through evasive answers like a blade. She scanned the room, her presence undeniable. She gavelled the room to attention. The echoes bounced off the walls. "We are convened today under Emergency Motion 1173B, brought forth by the Office of the Inspector General," she began, supported by testimonial and documentary evidence submitted by Mr. Malcolm Pierce. She turned toward him, eyes steady. "Mr. Pierce, you may proceed." Malcolm stepped to the center of the courtroom. No notes, no script. He didn't need them. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonant but calm, "I stand here today not just for myself, but for every person whose dignity was quietly signed away in the name of convenience. I was arrested without probable cause. I was profiled, judged, and paraded like a criminal in front of the courthouse where I serve." He gestured to the gallery behind him, "But my story is just the headline. What lies beneath it is a rot that stretches beyond one officer, one department, or one city. It is a pattern, a culture, a silent agreement that says some lives are more suspicious than others." Judge Whitaker nodded once but didn't interrupt. She was listening. Malcolm's eyes scanned the room. The evidence speaks for itself. The spreadsheet, the emails, the shadow docket. A coordinated effort to monitor, target, and detain black citizens under the guise of public safety. Whitaker leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, policy failure alone doesn't prove intent. Do you have direct proof of organized wrongdoing?" Malcolm turned his gaze to the back corner of the courtroom. And then, slowly, Officer Simmons stood. A hush fell over the chamber. Simmons walked to the front, each step dragging the weight of years behind him. He clutched the flash drive tightly, his knuckles white against the plastic. "I do," Simmons said, his voice rough but sure. "I'd like to testify." Judge Whitaker motioned him forward. The clerk swore him in. The room held its breath. "I was Officer Rollins' partner for 4 years," Simmons began, his eyes flicking between the judge and Malcolm. "During that time, I witnessed dozens of stops that had no legal justification. I stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't my place to question the system, but the day we stopped Malcolm Pierce outside this courthouse, that broke me." The gallery stirred. Some nodded slowly. Others sat frozen. Simmons opened his folder, pulling out printed emails, text logs, screenshots. "These are internal directives. Not official policy, but emails, group texts, call logs." Officers were encouraged to keep eyes on the usuals. Names were shared, photos, addresses, and there was a database, a shared folder we called the shadow docket. The words hit like a hammer. "DeFaulkner knew," Simmons continued, his voice cracking slightly. "He authorized the data collection. He added names, so did others." Judge Whitaker's brow arched. "Do you have proof?" Simmons nodded, holding up the flash drive. "It's all here, the full archive. Every stop, every name." The courtroom buzzed, reporters scrambling, pens flying across paper. Even the federal agents in the back blinked, their stoic faces cracking under the weight of what they were hearing. Whitaker restored order with a firm gavel strike. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. Your testimony will be entered into the official record." Simmons didn't return to his seat. He walked straight out of the courtroom, head down, but shoulders lighter. Malcolm stepped back to the center. "I ask this court," he said, voice steady, "not just to review these documents, but to issue immediate injunctions against any local or state agency utilizing discriminatory data algorithms." He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down. "I ask for a federal investigation, and I ask this court, on behalf of the Constitution, to name this for what it is, a violation of the most sacred rights we claim to protect." Judge Whitaker sat silent for a moment, her gaze scanning the room, weighing every word. Then she spoke. "This court finds sufficient cause to issue a preliminary injunction, effective immediately," she declared. "All parties named in these files will be subject to federal review, and pending further investigation, the Charleston District Attorney's Office will be placed under special oversight." The words echoed, sharp and final. Gasps broke out across the room. Applause started, but Whitaker slammed the gavel once more. "This is not theater," she said, eyes fierce. "This is reckoning." Malcolm stood still, not triumphant, not relieved, just resolute. The battle wasn't over, but the ground had shifted, and outside, the city of Charleston, watching from its streets, its doorways, its porches, knew it. This time, the system felt it too. Sometimes, the greatest battles we face aren't on the streets, they're in the quiet spaces where systems operate unchecked. Malcolm Pierce's story reminds us that even when you play by the rules, wear the right suit, carry the right title, there are forces that can still try to reduce you to a stereotype. But what matters is what we do after that moment. Do we stay silent? Or do we stand up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong? For those of us who've seen decades pass, who've marched, spoken out, and maybe grown weary, this story is a powerful call. It tells us that change doesn't belong to the young alone. It belongs to those who carry memory, who know what injustice looks like because they've lived through it. And while the fight may be long, justice moves when we push. So whether you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, know this: your voice, your stand, still matters, because silence is easy, but speaking up, that's how legacies are built.